My name is Denise Abdul-Rahman. I'm the Environmental Climate Justice Chair for the state of Indiana. And my guests here today are Dr. Carlton Waterhouse of IU Robert McKinney School of Law, Mr. Imhotep Adisa, Executive Director of KI Echo Center, and we have attorney Brian Bullock of his own law firm, as well as other advocacy. Just to let you know that the agenda or purpose of this environmental climate justice is to really discuss ways and how to advocate for clean air, clean water, and clean land. And there's a lot of different silos that help facilitate that. So all of us should know that we have the right to have clean air, clean water, and clean land in which to grow our food. And I don't know what your total awareness is, but with a lot of the industrial complexes now, our communities are inundated with a lot of toxicity. So I'm not going to talk very long. Again, we have a very prestigious group of experts, so I'm going to let them speak to the issues, and then we'll kind of wrap it up with what we should advocate for in the environmental climate justice policy that will result in community empowerment. And my goal is to get everyone in here to tell us what you would like to see the state of Indiana do as it relates to our communities that are impacted by these toxins. What type of action would you like to see happen in the form of a resolution? So with that said, I'm very proud to have Dr. Carlton Waterhouse to start out first, and he's an environmental justice professor. He's also writes on reparations. He has many publications. His bio is just too vast for me to cover it righteously. So please give him a hand.
Are we sitting or are we standing?
Whatever you'd like to do.
Okay. All right. All right. Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. How's everybody doing this afternoon?
Good.
Wonderful. I'm so glad to hear that. I was just very honored and pleased when Diane asked me if I could be part of this wonderful occasion and this event. You have to excuse me for being a bit disheveled. I just flew in from Houston and drove straight down from the Indianapolis airport so I could be here with you all. But I know it's definitely, but it's definitely worth the time, because I'm just always encouraged when I see a room full of people who are committed to justice. And that's what I want to talk to you all about on this afternoon. Is I want to talk to you about justice, and I want to talk to you about environmental justice. How many of you all are familiar with the idea of environmental justice? Raise your hand. Okay, good. So a good deal of awareness. For those of you who are a little less familiar, environmental justice is a way of explaining the reality that when it comes to the environment and when it comes to ecology, African Americans, Latinos, Asians, and poor whites are disproportionately suffering the harmful effects of pollution. It also reflects the fact that these communities suffer disproportionately the harmful effects of natural disasters. And it also, as Denise would certainly chime in, it also reflects the fact that with the risk of global climate change, these communities will be the ones who suffer the worst effects of climate change. So environmental justice is about the injustices that some communities face when it comes to the harms that come from the environment. Now that's a domestic phenomenon. It's something that exists in the United States, but it's also a global phenomenon. It's a worldwide reality. And part of the reason there hasn't been a global agreement on how to deal with the problems of climate change and greenhouse gases is because countries that are developing countries, that are countries that are made up of people in the developing world, primarily China and India, have said to the Western nations that are developed already, the reason we have too much carbon in the environment is because you all have polluted the environment for the last 100 plus years. And there's so much carbon in the environment that the climate has already started to change. That's the result of the industrialization of the United States, the industrialization of Canada, the industrialization of England and France and Spain and Portugal, etc., etc., etc. And so when they came together to try to make an agreement about climate change, the developing world countries said, wait a minute, you filled up the bathtub all the way to the brim. And then as soon as we decided we needed to get some water too, you said we're causing a problem. And they said, if you want us to stop developing so that we don't have global climate change, you're going to have to stop making carbon that creates even more problems. Because countries like the United States have a disproportionate share of the carbon footprint. In other words, even though we represent a small percentage of the population, we represent 4 or 5 times that percentage of the carbon that's put into the environment. So those countries in the developing world said it is not just and it's not fair for you to hold us responsible for the problem. You've got to do your part. And what's going on in the global sphere is also what's happening domestically, in our lives and in our communities. There are some people who benefit a great deal from manufacturing plants. There are some people who benefit a great deal from polluting facilities. Those are the people who sit on the boards of and own stock in and are corporate executives for the corporations that are polluting. And they reap profits from that pollution. But you know what? They don't live anywhere near those facilities. Do you know why? Because those facilities pollute, and the persons who get the pollution are the people who live what? Next to the facilities. And the people who live next to the facilities, do you think they're the people who sit on the board of directors for the corporations? Do you think they're the people who are the primary stockholders in the corporations? Are they the people who represent the chief executives for the corporations or the vice presidents for that matter? They are not. So we have a significant set of problems associated with the injustice, which is racial and is also economic, in the way corporations operate, pollute neighborhoods, and then the people who get the benefits don't live there and they don't look like the people who live there. And so when people complain we're getting sick from this pollution coming out of this facility, the people who don't live there also don't care. So environmental justice is about bringing justice to our experiences of pollution in terms of why should communities of color bear the burden of the pollution and then other communities reap the benefits of the pollution. Now, when you ask about bearing the burdens, what do I mean by that? What I mean is we have the incidence of asthma that require us to go to the emergency room because we're living in the cities that have the poor air quality that's a result of the pollution. Other people who don't have these problems live way out in areas that don't have as much air pollution because they don't live near the facilities and they don't live where all the cars are. So in terms of the way people's, in terms of the way our segregated living has happened in this country as a result of racism historically operating to segregate where people of color live and where whites live, most of the time in your urban areas, pollution is concentrated around where African Americans and Latinos live. And the cleaner and greener environments are in the suburbs where whites live. And those suburbs were created intentionally by government and by business interests. There was a federal housing authority plan that required, going as early as the 1930s, that you could not get a loan at a discounted rate with a federal subsidy if you were a bank and you lent money to communities that had a red line drawn around them. And which communities had a red line drawn around them? Communities that were integrated had red lines drawn around them. Communities that were African American had red lines drawn around them. So the whole idea of redlining was because the federal government said, we won't give you a subsidized loan as a bank. Now the reason we had all the housing that was built from the 1930s on up is because it used to be a lot more expensive to try to build a house. Why? Because you had to pay a down payment sometimes around 50% of the cost of the house. And you had to finish paying off the loan in a short period of time, like 6 or 7 years. Well, when the Federal Housing Authority got involved, they said, tell you what, we will subsidize your loans, banks, so that you can carry out the mortgage instead of 6 or 7 years, let them pay it over a long term, like 30 years. And you can drop the down payments from 50% down to something like 5% or 10%. And what we'll do is, bank, if they default on the loan, we'll cover you. So the banks had this whole new set of monies that allowed them to be able to give out loans to construct all of the suburbs all over the United States. And almost all of those suburbs were subsidized to be white only. And all of that is relevant because when you look at where the polluting facilities are and you look at how our segregated neighborhoods are, you see that the polluted facilities never coincide with what? Those suburbs. So somebody was thinking in advance about who was not going to be near these polluting facilities and who was. And that goes way, way back. Now the purpose of our coming together today is to talk about advocacy to address the problems of environmental justice and community engagement. And what I want to focus my remarks on is a little variation on our theme. I want to talk about methods of community empowerment that will enable us to advocate for environmental justice. And I want to use as an example a community in South Carolina that is outside of Charleston in Spartansburg. And in Spartansburg, South Carolina, in the Forest Park and Arkwright communities, there were a group of people who were besieged by polluting facilities. I'm going to just read a short description in terms of what they found. So they had the old city of Spartanburg landfill, which had basically accounted for almost 100% of the medical, auto, and industrial waste historically dumped in the city of Spartanburg. To the left and rear of the community was an operating chemical facility that was supposed to originally have been an apartment complex that never got built. Next to that, there was a fertilizing plant that was operating. And in addition to the fertilizing plant, there were 2 Superfund sites and 6 brownfield sites. Brownfield sites are old, toxic dumping sites that are no longer operating. And Superfund sites are sites that were so contaminated that the federal government had to spend money to clean them up. So this community was encircled with polluting facilities. And one of the community members named Harold Mitchell, who's now a state representative in South Carolina. Harold Mitchell had had his father and his sister die of rare forms of cancer. And he was convinced that their cancer and their deaths and the deaths of a number of other people in those communities were a result of their exposure to the pollutants that were in that community. There are a lot of ways to respond to that kind of situation, but I draw on this community for community engagement purposes because they create what I think is a very important model. And what they did was they decided that they didn't want to have all of these negative polluting facilities. But they didn't just protest the presence of the polluting facilities. They got together as a community and they did the 3 things that I'm going to recommend that are important for engaging communities to bring about environmental justice. They organized around a common purpose, number 1. And their organizing around a common purpose was not the elimination of the polluting facilities. What would be even better than just getting rid of the polluting facilities in a community? What's better than not having the pollution? Educating the community is part of the steps to create a new community. But what do you want to see instead of the pollution? So beyond just getting rid of, clean the community, and then what's it going to look like once it's clean? They wanted to construct new kinds of land uses. So instead of not having a fertilizer plant, they wanted a community health clinic. Instead of not having a Superfund site, they wanted to have a library. Instead of not having a old dump site, they wanted to have a community center for children to come to. So their first purpose was to come together to create a vision for a new community or a transformed community, right? So it wasn't just the absence of the pollution, but it was the presence of the kinds of community services that they needed, that they wanted, and that they deserved. So to engage environmental justice, you want to begin by moving from protest to prosperity. It can't be just about complaining about what is there. It has to be about having a vision for what can be and what should be there. So they began with a visioning process. So they didn't begin by protesting, they began by coming together around a common purpose. And they said, what would you like to see in this community when we are finished our work? So they started with a positive attitude and a visioning process for transformation. The second step that they engaged, after they decided what they wanted to see as a community, was the idea of collective work and responsibility. So they developed an action plan for how they were going to move from a community that was surrounded and inundated with pollution to a community that would be so desirable that anyone and everyone would want to live there, based on the vision that they had developed. And their collective action plan was divvying up responsibility among all of the people who were there on what steps they would take positively to bring about community transformation. So they decided to work collaboratively to make the difference. And they did that by going actively from door to door to say, we have a vision and we want you to be a part of what the vision looks like for a new community here. What would you like to see? And what can you do to help us bring this about? Can you come to this meeting? Can you write this letter? Can you make this phone call? What can you do to help bring this about? The next thing that they did was they believed in a principle of what's possible. Sometimes we begin and we frustrate our efforts to bring about justice because we begin with the idea that it'll never happen. I was just giving a talk recently on reparations for Jim Crow injustices. And one of the persons at the event said, you know, I think it's a wonderful idea, I think it's a beautiful vision, but it'll never happen. And I understood exactly what they were saying. And I know our ancestors who were enslaved, some of them said one day, this slavery thing is going to end. And I know somebody else said, it'll never happen. Right? Somebody was riding on the back of the bus and the bus driver pulled off before they could get on it. And somebody said, this is horrible, I hate this, I wish we could stop it. And somebody looked and said, it'll never happen. But somebody else said, we can make this happen. And because they said they could make it happen, they actually did make it happen. Slavery did come to an end, and African Americans and whites and others fought together to bring it to an end. Jim Crow did come to an end, and it took African Americans and others and whites to fight together to bring it to an end. And then I said in that event, I said, you know, you're actually right. I do understand why you might feel like it'll never happen. And I heard some people saying that in 2007. When I heard that this man named Barack Obama was going to run for president. And most of the people said, when he said he was going to run, almost everybody I heard, particularly everybody I heard who was black, said, it'll never happen. They said, it's a wonderful idea, he's a great guy, but it'll never happen. But somehow it happened. And somehow it happened through the efforts of common people coming together to make it happen. And so this is what I say about environmental justice. You have to begin with a positive belief that we can transform our communities, that we can bring about a new vision for what we want to see. And with that positive attitude, which is an attitude that they always maintain, they had amazing success. You know what they did? They brought in $167 million worth of grants to transform that community. So not only did they get the sites cleaned up, the dirty facilities closed down, but they got their community center, they got their health clinic, they got their library, and they got all of these other things that they had positively envisioned could come about. Because they worked collaboratively, they maintained a very positive attitude. And they recognized, you know what, there's money out there to do what we want to do. But we have to have a plan and a vision for what we want to see happen, and we have to be willing to rely on each other, to work together to bring it about. The truth is, most of these federal agencies have grant monies to help people deal with these kinds of problems. For health clinics, for environmental restoration, for redevelopment where you've had brownfields. And they organize together to use these resources to transform their community. So the key that I want to leave with you is that through community empowerment, we can bring about environmental justice. And it starts with community empowerment. It starts with recognizing a common purpose and setting a vision for what that looks like. Collectively taking on responsibility for the transformation, and then having a positive vision for what is possible and bringing that vision to a close. Thank you all very much.
Next we'll have Mr. Imhotep Adisa. Again, he is with KI Echo Center, and he has other KI organizations, and he's executive director, and they're doing phenomenal work. They're a prime example of grassroots work and transforming our communities.
Well, I guess it's just time to open up for questions and answers after that presentation. How do I follow that, you know what I'm saying? Greetings. As she said, I'm Imhotep Adisa. Our organization is Kepler Institute. We run a community empowerment center in Indianapolis, Indiana. And I'm just going to build a little bit on some of the things I heard the professor speak to. I'm not going to take too long. I'll talk a little bit about our work specifically. And then I'm going to sit down. Leave a lot of room for questions. I want to start with how many people in the room are under 30 or under. Raise your hand. Just two guys from the KI Eagle Center.
You stacked the deck.
Yes. And the first challenge I want to have to everybody here, we've got to work harder to drag our young people to these presentations. I would like to encourage you to pay them to come if necessary. Give them 10 bucks, 15 bucks. They love money. But if we end up continuing to have this conversation just with the old people in the room, this conversation is going to come to a close. So that's the first thing. Who's got Twitter accounts and Facebook accounts? Okay. How many of you guys in our workshop today? Look at that, guys. I know Waterhouse has a Twitter. Follow him on Twitter.
At Carlton WJD.
This guy's all over the country talking, so you can find out what's going on around the country just by following him on Twitter.
WJD.
I'm going to start with how did we get here through my lens? And Carlton talked about the Industrial Revolution, the whole use of carbon fuel and went crazy. And so how did we get there? And so a lot is tied to the idea of progress through a rational technological lens. Separated the earth and spirit from rational thought. That is a critical part of why we find ourselves here. Because now we believe, because of science, that we're capable of creating and fixing anything and everything. So the place that we live is under attack by us. We are destroying we can't get up and move to the suburbs and get away from it. We can build some places to protect ourselves from the floods, some, move away from these islands where people live in their entire civilizations. But climate change, I'm not going to use climate change. Climate collapse. Climate collapse is going to put the entire species of human civilization at risk. We may not survive this if we don't get our hands around it. And a lot of our approach to the solution has been very, very rational. We go to these UN meetings. We talk about, well, China's doing this and we're doing that. Sometimes we agree to sign the resolution, sometimes we don't. Sometimes we sign and then we don't agree, we don't even do anything once we get them signed. This is likely to be the hottest year in recorded history. In recorded history, it's getting hotter and hotter and hotter. The whole planet is under attack primarily because of our addiction, not the cocaine, not the crack cocaine or any of those other drugs, carbon, our addiction to carbon. The dilemma also, China says, hey, we want to play in this game. And what are they trying to do? They're trying to create a middle class. To do what? More consumption. The consumption is going to lead to more depletion of resources. So part of what we have to try to figure out what to do is, what does it mean to be human? In other words, are we here to consume? Is that the whole purpose of living? 3 more cars, 4 more cars, 5 more of this, 6 more of those? As the population is growing. Now we do want to deal with equity and fairness, because right now we're always on the end of that. But unless we can also begin to walk to the idea that being on the planet is about more than consuming and gathering up trinkets, because next year that trinket is going to be old. The leather in the new car is not going to smell good anymore. Oh, I got to go get another new car. That's a consumption-based problem. Now, the biggest part of this dilemma is that it's now globalized. It's all interconnected. France has a hiccup. Banking system has a hiccup over here. Whoop, whole damn thing's in crisis. You can't fix it unless you figure out how to make more trinkets, do more consumption. At some point in time, we got to take a closer look at what is it right there, fundamentally, that we have to begin to try to address. Environment. So that's the big piece. Rational, spiritual, separation. Need to figure out how to bring those two back together and put back into our lives, what does it mean to be alive? What does it mean to be fulfilled? Eco Center, Kepler Institute. 10 years ago, 11 years ago, we decided to start an organization called the Kepler Institute. It was started because that young man sitting back there in the back, it's my son, had screwed up in school. He had figured out that, oh, in order not to go to summer school, I'll just make sure I don't tell them that I got an E in my algebra class until it was too late to go to summer school. So my wife is back there, she was outraged. Said, hey, this is your problem. Fix this. So at that time we were working, Paulette now, who's back there, she's a member of our organization also, at a rehab resource facility for recycle reuse. So his assignment was he had to come to work every day, do algebra and work. Summer privileges were gone, over. And then take the algebra class again in the fall. That was the punishment for being slick. Well, his buddy who lived next door said, hey, I want to come. And then his other buddy from around the corner said, hey, I want to come. And then Paulette's grandson from Florida was going to be here. And then another young man said, hey, I want to come. So what was start off as a punishment and the consequence turned into 5 or 6 young African-American males who wanted to come to this summer program. And So we ran our summer program, and then at the end of the summer, guess what happened? They said, hey, what are we going to do in the fall? So out of that, Careful Institute was born. African American male focal point, primary initiatives on trying to figure out how to keep these guys off the streets and try to get them through school. It was a hell of a journey. So we managed, that happened. Out of that original group, two graduated from college, probably? Three of them have gotten through college, acquired their degrees. We lost one of them temporarily to the streets. Spent some time in prison for being in the drug game. Out, back, saying, hey, I'm trying to get myself together. So they go through school. Paula and I continue to run our center. They, junior, senior year in college, a couple of them come back and say, hey, we need to put back in. We want to build on this center. So then we had to figure out as old people how to include young people and get out of their way and let them lead us around and things we want to say, oh, there's no way that's going to work, man. We tried that already. So, I mean, you know that story. So then out of that came this part two of this journey for us. Our journey into the environment came when each month they do a workshop on something we present to the community. And the goal was to allow the community to see, parents, family, neighbors, that it's possible to teach and have your young people, young men particularly, to learn a variety of subjects, present articulately to the community, and inform. And we would do that every month. And folks would just be like, wow, how'd you do that? Well, we just did it. We come together, we eat, and we do it. It required no money, not one dime. So, fast forward to the present, that continues to happen, now often led and driven by some of the young people who've been involved in our work. So out of that, we have these enterprises that we've created. We call them empowerment enterprises, social enterprises. Now, Denise thinks we're not interested in money. She's always said, oh, you guys don't want any money. And that's not quite true. We just don't want money that dictates our voice and our direction. So we're real careful about who we take money from, what the conditions are for, because at the end of the day, we want to be able to continue to speak truthfully and directly to power. And at the same time, demonstrate to our community that you can create what you want where you are with whatever you got. And we created KI New Media, which is our flagship enterprise, with no money. We taught ourselves how to do web designs, social media, video work. Visit our website, you'll see it. Didn't take one dime to do that. A young man that worked with us 10 years before that had his own company in Atlanta. He caught up on a subcontract work to us. So we ate off of that for 3 years. Work that he was doing in Atlanta. His sister's one of our designers. So that's how we talk about empowerment and building, by creating institutional infrastructure that allows us to create what we can, where we are, what we have. First, talk about vision. That's the idea of not having a deficit model. Oh, I can't get this done because we don't have. Another enterprise we started out of our Urban Ag Initiative is a restaurant in our neighborhood that does, we pick their compost up, their food waste, and we convert it to compost. We've been doing that for 2 years. For free. We don't charge them anything. Just teaching our young people how to interface with other people in your community who don't look like you, don't talk like you, don't necessarily have the same interests. They came back and said, hey, you guys, are y'all growing arugula in your aquaponics operation? Fish, plants together. Said, yeah, we grow arugula. We'll buy that from you. So we have an urban ag science lab that we set up on a lot that the church owns in the building that we're in, no charge. Got a greenhouse on it, built by Eagle Scout group, no charge. We raised our first set of arugula, sold it to the restaurant. Our young people involved from beginning to end. 10 years from now, what will they know? They'll say, well, damn, I remember back when we did KI. We went over and took that empty lot and raised our own food and sold it to the restaurant. Or the technology. I remember they taught us all how to do the technology. So they won't have a sense that it's not doable. So you have to return and instill back into our communities the capacity of doing for self. That doesn't mean they don't owe us and that we shouldn't go get those other things and demand it, because we pay taxes like everybody else. Reparations argument, we owe. There's a debt owed to us, not payable. It can't be paid. Interest on it is not payable, ever. It's not. And do we expect them to pay it? Maybe not. But we know that that's something that's ours and we shouldn't give up that argument. But that's the first thing that we have to try to figure out how to reinstore in our communities. What else do I want to say? Environment. For me, I like to expand out the environmental conversation. Yes, it's about climate, food, air, water, all those things. But there's other aspects of the environment. There's nothing that's not environmental. Everything we do is environmental. Ferguson is an environmental issue. That's an environmental issue. Black men shot down, unarmed, throughout this country is an environmental issue. If nothing else, it creates stress. You're walking down the street, what's going on? The police roll up. Your stress levels off the chain. That's an environmental issue. Gun violence in our communities, environmental issues. So it's important to separate them for distinction in conversations, but one of the things that we have to do is control the agenda and the conversation ourselves. We can't let other people tell us what's important to our community. We want to talk about climate change? Yeah. We talk about climate collapse. We want to talk about Ferguson too. We want to make sure those issues are also on the table and expect the people that expect us to support these other agendas to support our work too. So is there anything else I want to say? Visit our website, www.kepler.org. Follow us on Twitter. What's the Twitter tag? KI Equals Center.
That's it, at KI Equals Center.
At KI Equals Center. Check out our videos on YouTube. You'll see our young people that do great work. When you get back to your communities, I challenge you to start doing what we do, and that is talk about these issues with others. When you get through watching the Colts and Indiana Pacers playing, you're having that six-pack, slide in that video, say, hey, let's look at this video here. When you go to the barbershop, bring up those discussions in the barbershop and turn the barbershops and beauty shops in places that are more than just conversations about sports. Still brag about your grandsons and your children, how well they're doing in school, keep that in there. But we have a responsibility to amplify the level of awareness about these issues in our communities. And if we do that, if we just get the conversation broader, as we're creative people, we figure out solutions. You know, we don't know what they are now, but we figure them out by just making sure that we keep that in front of us and talk about it. Raise your children to be critical thinkers. Make them ask hard questions. Have the patience to sit down and listen to them, even if you think what they're talking about is off the wall, crazy and insane. And then bring them to these events. Because if we don't get our young people engaged here, this fight's over. We lost this fight. Just be reading about it. Somebody might, the marshals when they come and say, what happened to the humans? Although they lost that back in 2015. Thank you.
Next, our presenter is attorney Brian Bullock, who's with Bryant Bullock LLC, and he has done work with Guantanamo Bay and received the Frederick Douglass Human Rights Award for that work. He's also obtained the Joseph Pitts Award from the Gary branch of the NAACP for work in labor and industry. And he's also with the Calumet Project for, and I always get to pronounce that wrong, for those of you from Gary. How do you say it? Calumet. Yes, thank you. And he has also written a lot of works as well. So if you please give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today. I was trying to get Imhotep to go last. I didn't want to have to follow everybody else. There's going to be a lot of overlap between what the previous presenter said and what I'm going to say, so kind of bear with me because I will be repeating a lot of the same things. However, I'm also going to approach this from a little bit of a different perspective. And that perspective, I think, at least from my perspective, gets directly to the heart of the issue from my experience. So number one, I'm a writer, I'm an attorney, I teach as well. So words and language are very, very important to me. I'm always very careful about how I frame things, how I say whatever I say in a conversation. So we've been talking about environmental justice for a long time. And now we're talking about climate justice. Personally, I think both of those two terms sort of missed the mark. Environmental justice initially was called environmental racism, right? And I think that as African Americans, we need to go back and reclaim the word racism. We need to talk about race directly. It's not that we don't want justice, but justice seems kind of, open to interpretation. Racism is what it is. And I've seen that even people on the right wing are using the term racism, right? And so you hear people on Fox News saying the president is racist, right? But that's because we've given away our power to use that term, to call things exactly what they are. So I'm going to talk in terms of environmental racism and climate racism as well. The other thing about the use of the word justice is that I think it minimizes what it is that African Americans have been going through in this country and what we deal with on a day-to-day basis in this country, right? So rather than watering it down to talk about justice, and it's not that I'm not concerned about justice, and it's not that justice isn't one of those things that we're concerned with, but from my reading of the history, what we have been trying to achieve in this country is not simply justice, we've been trying to survive in America. And climate justice and environmental justice, from my perspective, is an issue of survival. I don't separate out, as Imhotep said, I don't separate out environmental justice from any other aspect of what black people go through in this country. So for me, environmental racism is no different from police brutality and mass incarceration and employment discrimination and any of the other ills that black people deal with in this country. It's simply one more area of survival. It's just one more front that we've had to battle on. And so I choose to use the term racism as opposed to justice. Also, I think when we talk about environmental racism, then we understand exactly what we're dealing with. And we don't expect the Justice Department to come and save us. Just like we don't expect the Justice Department to stop police killings and police brutality, at least I don't. Then when we understand that we're dealing with racism, then we understand that the answers that we seek, as they've said, are within our own community. That we have to solve this problem, that the cavalry is not coming, right? It hasn't come yet. It ain't coming with this issue either, right? So we need to understand that. Also, because I've done a lot of EJ work over the years, environmental racism work over the years, what I know is that even though environmental justice, the term environmental justice is used to bring in or to articulate the fact that poor whites also face environmental hazards in their communities. What I also know is that the majority of the communities that are burdened by environmental toxins are communities of color, plain and simple. Right? And so we shouldn't be afraid to talk about environmental racism and climate racism as opposed to environmental justice instead. Sorry about that. It also highlights the fact that environmental organizations, by and large, have not been concerned about what we call environmental justice or environmental racism. So if you look at the efforts of most environmental organizations, which are primarily white, they've been concerned about protecting endangered species. Now, I'm concerned about protecting endangered species as well. I love animals. I love the environment. I'm an environmentalist. However, what most environmental organizations have not realized is that many of us believe that young black men are an endangered species. They've been talking about protecting wild areas and the rainforest and the savanna, but most environmental organizations have not been focused on protecting the environment in the concrete jungle. The concrete jungle is urban communities, black communities primarily, right? And so I think I saw something online where there's a lot of discussion and outrage over the fact that a young man killed this rare white deer or antler or something like that. Again, I'm concerned about those things too. However, what we don't see is many environmentalists, as Imhotep said, we don't see them coming out to Ferguson as environmental groups. We don't see that same kind of solidarity with us on issues that pertain directly to us, right? And so, again, understanding all that, we understand that this is primarily and fundamentally an issue of racism. Black communities in this country, whether we're talking about Gary or Camden, New Jersey, or Baltimore, Maryland, or Detroit, oftentimes themselves are quarantined off from the rest of the state or the rest of the communities that they're situated in, right? And so within that quarantine area, you find a lot of things are allowed to go on that don't go on outside of those quarantine areas. So joblessness is allowed to exist in these quarantine zones. High crime is allowed to exist in these quarantine zones. Environmental degradation is allowed to exist within these quarantine zones. And I call them quarantine zones because there's like this invisible line, this invisible rope around certain communities, where again, things are allowed to happen and jobs aren't allowed to come into those communities, right? At least it seems that way. So again, we have to understand exactly what we're dealing with, face it head on, be willing to talk about it straight to get the kind of results that I think that we're gonna need to fix this, to address this issue. In fact, some people believe that our communities are disposable communities. And the people within those communities obviously are disposable people. Because again, the cavalry doesn't come in to save those people, to save those communities. The resources don't come in there to address those problems, as if there's some kind of magical line that prevents that from happening. When we look back on what happened in New Orleans when Katrina hit, although there's a lot of talk about what happened, I didn't see, and I still don't see, a lot of preparation for what could happen to similar type communities. Right? So the hurricane obviously didn't just hit that one area of town. It had a disproportionate impact in that area because that community was poorer and coincidentally blacker as well, or browner as well, right? And so that should have been a wake-up call for every single urban black community in this country, that when the federal government did not respond quickly, if it happened there, it could happen to us in Baltimore. It could happen to us in Gary. We call Gary GI. It could happen to us in GI, right? It could happen to us in Camden, New Jersey, or in Detroit. What we see happening in Detroit right now, where people are having their water shut off, that's an environmental issue. And black people, wherever you live, need to be thinking, that could happen to us too, where we live. Also, talking about environmental racism in this context also helps us to understand that, I think as the professor also mentioned, that this is not simply a domestic issue, right? The environment stretches everywhere, and guess what? Racism exists all across the globe. Excuse me. And so communities of color all across the world are facing very similar issues. And so we as black people in the United States, when we're talking about environmental racism, also should be looking at what's happening to people in Palestine and Iraq, and understand that largely what's happening to them, these other poor black and brown people. are happening to them because of who they are and not what they have done. And so it links our struggles in a way that black people used to do. We used to always talk about what's happening in Cuba, what's happening on the continent. We understood that this was not simply a domestic battle that we were engaged in, that we were engaged against racism and capitalism and imperialism all across the globe. As environmentalists, or as an environmentalist, it's my position that if we are to be anti-imperialist, if we are concerned about the global climate, that although climate change is real, climate change is inevitable, climate change is occurring right now, still the greatest threat to the environment, from my perspective, is nuclear war. And so as environmentalists, we have to be anti-imperialists. As environmentalists, we have to be anti-war. There is no greater threat to the security and safety of this entire planet than nuclear war. Right? So we have to understand that as well. When we look at Katrina and the government's response, and again realize that this is an issue that black people are facing across the globe. When we look at what happened in Haiti, also an environmental issue is earthquake. The responses by the powers to be were very similar, right? And so in Katrina, the government didn't show up immediately. And then when they did, many people don't know this, but they sent in these mercenary organizations like Blackwater. I don't know if you heard of Blackwater or not. They're paramilitary organizations. They sent them in there pointing guns at these poor black people who needed help. But what happened in Haiti? They sent in the UN and the US military ostensibly to help the people, and Haiti looks just as bad today as it did when that earthquake hit many years ago. We also have to understand that these environmental disasters are an opportunity for certain people or for certain institutions. So again, looking at what happened in New Orleans. If you go to New Orleans right now, most of the public schools have been closed, and now there's charter schools. They took this environmental disaster and used it as an opportunity to shut down the public school system. And for these private charters to make money off of our pain. So again, I think we have to be real and have to understand what's really going on, what's at stake, and what the real issues are, and the real effects are when we're talking about environmental racism, environmental justice, whichever one you think is most appropriate. A little bit about myself. I've been involved in various environmental justice, environmental racism issue, I guess old habits die hard, environmental justice, environmental racism issues throughout my career. And because there's a lot of environmental issues up north, as I'm sure there are in a lot of other places, a lot of poor black communities. And so I've been involved in environmental racism issues from the perspective of an attorney. I've been involved in environmental issues from a community activist standpoint. And I want to talk about my experience and what we've been doing up north, in the hopes that it will give you some ideas of what you can do in the communities that you live in as well. So my first foray into environmental racism came when a good friend of mine, Professor Earl Jones, who's a professor at Indiana University Northwest, had the idea to bring together what he called the Environmental Justice Partnership. And so he brought together various organizations and groups to partner around dealing with environmental racism in Northwest Indiana. And so at that time, I was with the Gary branch of the NAACP, and I saw that as part of my duties as an NAACP member and as an attorney working for Indiana Legal Services. I thought that was part of my duties as well as a poverty lawyer to be involved in this issue. So it was the NAACP, it was the Sierra Club, it was the Calumet Project, and it might have been a couple of other organizations. And the very first issue that we organized around was there was a plan to build a confined disposal facility in East Chicago, Indiana. And so the federal government came in and they finally said, that all the years of the steel mills dumping all these toxic lead and PCBs and heavy metals into the Calumet River finally needs to be cleaned up, right? And that's fine. We were in agreement with that. That's a good thing. The problem was they were going to build this confined disposal facility to put all this toxic sludge into, and they were going to locate it near a couple of high schools. So we organized several community forums. The community forums are important because most of our people don't understand what the issues are. We have to begin with the education piece first, right? Because our people don't understand why they should come out to something like this until we tell them why this is important to you, right? Don't stay home and watch Scandal tonight. Come to this meeting, right? This is important, right? So we knew that we had to educate the people in Gary about why they should be concerned about this. So we held several forums. We gave several seminars. We invited out various speakers. I spoke at several of those events to get the people to see why this was important. We even organized a protest rally in East Chicago to protest the building of this confined disposal facility, or a CDF for short. We knew that we could not stop the Army Corps of Engineers, that's who was building it, from building the CDF, and it wasn't our goal to stop them from building it anyway. We didn't want it next to these high schools. We couldn't stop that, but what we were successful in doing is getting them to, let me step back. What they were going to do is build it next to these high schools and leave the top open. So you have this big old toxic container with the top open. And I don't know if you know it now, but PCBs don't just stay in the soil, they leach out, they go into the air. Right? And so we were successful in getting them to make that concession where they would at least put a cap on that CDF. And so from our perspective, that was a success. Right? And we did that, again, because we organized the community around the issue. The next project that I was involved in with the Environmental Justice Partnership, there is a metropolitan planning organization. I'm sure you have one in Indianapolis as well. Most communities do. And these metropolitan planning organizations do planning for where roads are going to be built and where new communities are going to spring up and where sewage lines should be run and all this sort of thing, right? And so our metropolitan planning organization, or NPO for short, is called the Northern Indiana Regional Planning Commission, what we call NERC. They have a very sorry, sad, bad history of not being concerned about what happens in the urban core, called the urban core of Gary, Hammond, East Chicago, those older communities, right, that were left when the suburbanization happened and people began to move out to Maryville and Crown Point and all these other places, right? And so we knew that we had to engage them because every couple of years they develop a 10-year plan. So they have the 2020 plan, then it's the 2030 plan, then 2040 plan, 2050 plan. They forecast out every 10 years. So we became involved with the 2030 plan. The very first thing that we did, we went to one of their meetings, and my colleagues in the partnership, we didn't tell them we were all together, right? So we went to the meeting, and they said, well, we need a community person to be the chairperson of the meeting. Right? So all my colleagues said, well, Attorney Bullock, he'd be good for this role. Right? And they said, okay, yeah, Attorney Bullock does good. Right? Not knowing that we planned it like that. So I became the chairperson of what was called the Policy Subcommittee. The reason why that was important is because I got to steer the conversation. And my colleagues and I, all we talked about was environmental justice. All we talked about was infusing environmental justice into this 2030 plan. Every time they wanted to go left, we bring them back right? And then what I did was, they don't normally do this, but I implemented Robert's Rules of Order, right? On my own, right? We're gonna use Robert's Rules of Order. I'm the chairperson, right? So that way I could make sure that every time there was a vote on an issue, I knew I had numbers because my colleagues were there, right? So we were successful in infusing environmental justice, environmental racism principles into every aspect of the policy that we created. That's important because there's two parts of this. There's the policy and there's the actual plans, where the roads are really going to go and all of that. Where the plan is supposed to follow the policies, right? And so we developed the policies, and they had to make sure that the plan worked in conjunction with the policy. So that was very interesting. This gave me a lot of experience in working with, on the inside, with an organization like that. We're not the only ones. There's several organizations that have been fighting NAACP over the years. Everybody Counts, which is a disability rights organization. The Interfaith Federation. There's probably a few others that I'm missing. So we've been in battle with this particular NPO for a number of years, but I'm very proud of what we were able to accomplish as the EJ partnership. The last thing that I was involved in, at least from an official standpoint, was I was briefly on the board of the Calumet Project, but I wasn't really part of them very long. But what I did was, because of my association with them, because I did sit on their board very briefly, when the Indiana Department of Environmental Management issued a permit to BP Amoco to emit certain toxins into the air, the Calumet Project appealed the granting of that permit. Let me say kind of parenthetically that the Indiana Department of Environmental Management has never met a permit from a company that it didn't like, right? So if you're some type of major polluter or major company, if you want a permit, you got it, right? So they issued this permit, and the Calumet Project appealed the granting of that permit, and it wasn't just the Calumet Project, it was several other organizations as well. And so I acted as their attorney, and we engaged in litigation, essentially, against BP Amoco. We were ultimately able to win some concessions on that front as well. So the case didn't actually go to trial. We were able to get them to settle with us by making some concessions on their end and by giving some concessions to the Calumet Project. Now I want to talk about what the issues are right here in the good old state of Indiana. And again, I think that, we have to be real clear on what the issues are. We have to be willing to call racism racism. We have to be able to look the beast in the eye and speak to it directly. Indiana consistently ranks at the bottom of states that have regulations that are protective of the environment. It's normally between 47 and 49 out of 50 states, right? That means the environmental statutes in this state don't do a whole lot for the people who have to breathe in the air or for the environment itself. And that is because, as I said before, the Indiana Department of Environmental Management is mainly a corporate environmental agency. At least that's how we look at it, right? So if you are a corporation and you want to issue, or you want a permit, let me go back to Gary for a second. There was another battle I was involved in. There was this company called, I think it was called Midwest Medical Waste. And they wanted to build this facility in Gary where they would be transporting in bodily fluids and all this kind of crazy